Hello, my name is Garcia-Padilla, and for today's video, I'm going to start with part one, the techniques I saw when the investigators and first responding officers were interviewing and interrogating Chris Watts. And with the three that I noticed were open-ended questions, the questioning style by the investigators, and the investigators showing empathy. With that, let's start. Part one. Open-ended questions. I noticed this in the video, the case of Chris Watts, part one. The first responding officer would ask Watts different questions in the video. For example, at the 3:11 minute mark when Watts was texting someone on the phone, which was unusual in this instance because the husband would usually be worrying about his wife and kids are missing. And well, the officer asked Watts what time did he leave for work today, and Watts responded with between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. However, the way Watts responded was unusual because he would look at the officer and then he look back at his phone because he was texting someone. And I think the video, it said that this is unusual because usually when something bad happens in the family, you're calling, you're not texting. As well as the responding question or the next question the officer asked was if Watts and his wife are going through a marital issue, and what Watts responded with they're going through a separation. And well, I also noticed in the video at the 3-minute mark, whenever Watts responded to the officer, the guy in the red shirt would be looking at the officer instead of Watts. And I saw it as he was signaling to the officer that Chris was not acting how a husband would act in this situation. It was like he knew Chris was lying about the situation since of how he was portraying himself to the officer, and Shannon's friends were unusual since Shannon's friend Nicole and the guy in the red shirt picked up Chris's behavior. And then the second one I identified was questioning style by the investigators. I noticed this in the video, the case of Chris Watts part two, the polygraph. In this video, the male investigator switches between the good and bad cop. How he portrays as the good cop is by listening to Watts, showing empathy to him, as well as thanking him for talking before they start talking about the hard conversation Watts had with his wife, Shannon. The bad cop comes out when the male investigator is done hearing Chris Watts lies about loving his family, and then the investigator leans into Watts and starts confronting him by saying how he cannot convince the police officers outside the interview room that he had nothing to do with the disappearance of his family, especially since Watts was not the one to call 911. It was Shannon's friend Nicole, as well as how he randomly woke up his wife at the random of the night so he can get rid of the guilt he had because of him cheating on his wife. And I noticed the male investigator was trying to get Watts to. I know the male investigator was trying to get Watts to give an admission or a confession about what really happened between him and his wife when he decided to wake her up in the middle of the night. And now for the last one I saw was investigators just demonstrating empathy. I noticed this in the video raw. Chris Watts confessed to killing pregnant wife, daughters at the polygraph part four. The reason why she was showing empathy was, I believe, she wanted Watts to feel comfortable, so when the polygraph test occurred, the female investigator could get the best results from the test. The way she was doing this in the beginning was by asking Watts what Shannon's routine was before she got into bed. Watts then proceeds to tell the investigator the routine. You could tell by his tone of voice he felt comfortable, as well as body language, since it seems like he was explaining it truthfully, like Shannon does this every night. And well, through the first 4 minutes, the female investigator is also smiling and keeping eye contact throughout their interaction, trying to build trust with Watts. She was also asking reassuring questions through the first 10 minutes, as well as her tone of voice with these questions made where Watts would believe she is welcoming and a friend who was trying to help him, as well as she cares about the situation. Compared to her possibly being aggressive in an alternative world and hurting the results of the polygraph test, since he would feel distressed compared to feeling comfortable. That's pretty much all I have for part one, and now for part two. And well, for part two, I'm going to separate into two parts. The first part is going to be Watt's behavior in the initial interview slash police contact, and the second part is going to be the subsequent interrogation. In the initial interview slash police contact, the behavior that Watts displays is an unemotional one. Since his arrival, he seemed perfectly normal, which in this instance should not have happened because his wife and children are missing. Usually when something happens to a man's wife or children, they show some type of emotion because of how much they mean to men. Other behavior Watts portrayed was like he doesn't care, he doesn't want to be there. For instance, when everyone was upstairs, Watts was just on his phone, texting, and when the officer asked the first question, he looked at him, answered the question, and his eyes went straight back to his phone to avoid eye contact. Then, when the neighbor was showing Watts, Nicole, the guy in the red shirt, and the officer the video footage he captured of the morning of the disappearance, Watts looked nervous and scared. Like the video is going to show him putting the bodies in his truck. Lastly, when Watts left the neighbor's house and everyone stayed behind, they all had the feeling he was suspicious since he was acting strangely than normal. For instance, the neighbor noticed how weird Watts was acting since he has never acted like that before, like him repeating to the officer what he did that morning. Because what the neighbors were saying was Watts was an introvert person, and him repeating the officer 3 times what he did that morning was an unusual thing for Watts. Well, for the second part, the behavior Watts was portraying in the subsequent interrogation was a weird one. His behavior looked different from the male and female investigator, as well as from the polygraph to when he ultimately confesses about the murders. His behavior changes radically. From what I noticed in the video, he felt more comfortable talking to the female investigator than the male by the physical signs and verbal descriptions he was giving off. And what I remember mostly from the videos was when he was talking to the male investigator, Watts was on edge and he was portraying himself like a loving husband and father he is. However, he would slip up and use words like these and those when referencing his children, and he was basically telling the investigator he knows something happened to them. To compare this to when the female investigator was talking to him, Watts seemed more relaxed and more truthful. Granted, the male and female investigator were asking different questions when they were interacting. However, I noticed the female was sort of trying to let Watts know she is his friend by the actions she portrayed. Lastly, Watts shows his real behavior after failing the polygraph, confessing to the murders, and when his dad arrived. And from these 3 things, it looked like Watts was finally able to let go of the stress and pressure he was holding in, which was noticeable from him crying, him having his head down, and the conversation he was having with his father. And that's pretty much all I had to say for part 2. And well, these are just my thoughts about Chris Watts. I already knew about the Chris Watts case because I watched the documentary that Netflix put out in 2020, as well as some of the videos of the interrogation. However, I never deeply analyzed and watched his case like this. After doing so, Chris Watts was truly a monster, and I'm glad he did not get away and is paying his time. However, he could have simply avoided all of this if he simply would have just gotten a divorce from his wife. And well, that is it for my video. I hope you enjoyed my views and thoughts. Thank you for listening to me, and goodbye.